I still remember the night Daniel was born. The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and wilted lilies someone had left at the nurse's desk. I was only 21, trembling and exhausted, my body aching from hours of labor, yet when they placed that tiny bundle in my arms, my entire world rearranged itself in an instant. He had a head full of dark hair, and his little fingers wrapped around mine as though promising never to let go. I believed him. Back then, life was already unkind. My husband, if I can even call him that, left 3 months into my pregnancy. He said he wasn't ready to be a father, that he had his own dreams to chase. He vanished, leaving me with a swelling belly, unpaid rent, and more fear than I could bear. I thought I would crumble. But when I heard Daniel's first cry, strength I never knew existed bloomed inside me. He was mine, and I swore I would protect him from every storm, even if it meant standing in the rain myself. Raising him alone was never easy. By day I scrubbed other people's houses, my knees raw from hours of kneeling on tiled floors that gleamed but never reflected me. By night, I stitched clothes in a tiny rented room, the needle pricking my fingers until they bled. Sometimes I would come home so tired I could hardly stand, but the moment Daniel's little arms reached for me, all my exhaustion dissolved into warmth. We lived in a cramped apartment, the walls so thin I could hear the neighbor's television through the plaster. Still, I decorated Daniel's corner with handmade toys and second-hand books. On his birthdays, when I couldn't afford fancy cakes, I baked small, lopsided ones in an old oven that barely worked. He would clap his hands, his eyes shining, as if it were the grandest feast in the world. Those moments made every sacrifice worthwhile. I often skipped meals so he could eat. I wore the same faded coat for 5 winters, patching it again and again, while I made sure Daniel had a warm jacket each year. I pawned my mother's gold earrings, the only inheritance I ever had, so I could pay for his school trip when he was 12. I told him they had been stolen, but the truth burned in my chest each time I remembered my mother's face. Daniel grew into a bright boy, curious and ambitious. He had a way with numbers and an unshakable confidence that made me proud and afraid at once. He would look at me, sweaty and exhausted after a double shift, and say, "Mama, one day, you won't have to work like this. I'll buy you a big house with a garden, and you'll never worry about money again." I laughed it off sometimes, but in my heart, I believed him. Those words were the lullabies I clung to when despair threatened to drown me. High school came, and with it new challenges. Tuition, uniforms, books, it all cost more than I could manage. There were nights when I cried silently into my pillow, wondering if I had been selfish to bring him into such a hard world. But every time I thought of giving up, Daniel's dreams reminded me why I had to keep going. I worked triple shifts. I cleaned during the day, served at a diner in the evening, and folded laundry at night. My body ached, my hands hardened, my back bent. Sometimes I would collapse into bed just as dawn broke, only to wake 2 hours later to pack Daniel's lunch. My body screamed for rest, but my love for him was louder. There were sacrifices Daniel never even knew about, like the scholarship form I filled out for him at 16, only to find out I needed a small application fee. I sold my wedding ring, the one remnant of the man who had abandoned us, for that fee, or the winter I worked through pneumonia, because I couldn't afford to take a day off. I stitched clothes by candlelight, coughing so hard my chest rattled, but I kept going because Daniel's school needed a payment by the end of the week. Through it all, I told myself it would be worth it. Every blister, every tear, every hunger pang was a stepping stone to the life my son deserved. And Daniel, he wasn't ungrateful, not then. He would sit beside me when I sued, pretending to help but mostly distracting me with stories about his classmates and his dreams of building something bigger than anyone imagined. Sometimes he would kiss the top of my head and whisper, "You'll see, Mama. I'll make you proud." I would smile through my tears because I was already proud. Proud of his ambition, proud of his kindness, proud that despite the absence of a father and the weight of poverty, my boy still dared to dream. If I had known then what his dreams would cost me later, perhaps I would have prayed differently. But at the time, all I could see was the shining future ahead of him, and I told myself that whatever it took, I would get him there. Because that is what mothers do, we burn quietly so our children can shine. The shift in Daniel's life came so suddenly, it was as if fate had pulled a cruel trick on me. One moment, he was my boy, still calling me at night to ask how to cook rice, or reminding me to pray for him before an exam. The next, he was a man the world seemed to worship, and I became invisible in his new sky. It started innocently. Daniel was always fascinated with computers, spending hours hunched over our old second-hand laptop, the one I bought by cleaning 3 extra houses a week. He used to tinker late into the night, eyes glowing in the dim light, as if he were holding the universe in his hands. I didn't fully understand what he was doing, talking about apps, coding, and start-ups, but I encouraged him anyway. I told myself this was the seed of the future he always promised me. Then, one ordinary afternoon, everything changed. He came running home, breathless, waving his phone in the air. "Mama! Mama!" he shouted louder than I'd heard in years. It happened. The investors, they said yes. I didn't understand at first, but I could see the fire in his eyes. He told me his small project had caught the attention of a group of wealthy backers. Money poured in almost overnight. His little idea suddenly became a company, and my son was no longer just a dreamer. He was on the path to becoming rich beyond anything I had ever known. At first, I rejoiced with him. We celebrated with a simple meal of rice and chicken stew, the kind I could afford on my modest earnings. He hugged me tight that night, whispering, "This is it, Mama. Your sacrifices are paying off. No more suffering, no more small apartments. I'll take care of you now." I believed him. I let myself imagine a life where I could finally rest, where I could finally live, not just survive. But success has a strange way of changing people. It creeps in quietly, like a shadow at first, until one day it stands before you, unrecognizable. Daniel began dressing differently, tailored suits, shiny watches, shoes that cost more than my monthly rent. He started speaking faster, his words filled with terms I couldn't understand. He was always rushing, always on the phone, always somewhere else, even when he was sitting right in front of me. Then came the mansion. He invited me to see it once. A sprawling house with glass walls, chandeliers that looked like falling stars, and floors so polished I was afraid to walk on them. He showed me around like a tour guide, smiling proudly. But when I bent down to admire the detail of a hand-woven carpet, he stiffened. "Mama, please," he said, glancing nervously at his friends who lounged nearby with drinks in hand. Don't kneel like that. People might think." He didn't finish the sentence, but I heard it anyway. "People might think you don't belong here." It was the first time my son looked at me as though I embarrassed him. Soon, the calls became fewer. Where once he would phone me daily, now weeks passed without a word. When I tried to visit his office, the receptionist told me politely that I needed an appointment. An appointment? To see my own child. Then came her, a young woman, glamorous, with eyes that sparkled like glass, and a laugh that sounded like it had been rehearsed. She clung to Daniel's arm at every event, whispering into his ear while looking at me with a smile too sharp to be real. He introduced her as his girlfriend, later his fiancée. I tried to be kind, but something in her gaze told me she didn't see me as family, only as an inconvenience. My worst fear came true at his engagement party. The hall was grand, filled with men in suits and women draped in diamonds. I wore my best dress, an old navy blue one I had sewn myself, paired with a simple scarf. Compared to the others, I looked plain, invisible. But I held my head high, reminding myself that I was the woman who had given Daniel life, who had carried him when no one else would. When I walked up to him to congratulate him, his fiancée looped her arm around his and whispered something. He smiled awkwardly, then leaned toward me and said quietly, "Mama, maybe it's better if you sit in the back. Some of the guests might not understand." The words cut deeper than any blade. I sat in the back, my heart shattering with every laugh and cheer that echoed in that glittering hall. My son, the boy who once clung to me in the dark, was now ashamed to claim me in the light. After that night, things only worsened. Daniel stopped visiting my small apartment. When I called, his secretary often answered. When I begged him to come for a simple dinner, he said he was too busy. Too busy for the woman who had worked her fingers to the bone so he could stand where he stood. It became clear my son had abandoned me. Not physically. He still lived in the same city, surrounded by luxury, but emotionally, spiritually, in every way that mattered. And so, I learned a bitter truth sometimes. Success does not lift people higher. It only builds walls between them and those who love them most. I told myself I should be happy for him, that all mothers dream of their children rising above hardship. But every night, as I sat alone at the small table in my kitchen, staring at the empty chair where he once sat, I wondered if all my sacrifices had been for nothing. Because what good is a millionaire son if he forgets the mother who raised him from dust? Time has a cruel way of revealing truths we wish weren't real. Years passed after Daniel's rise, and though I tried to reach him, tried to remind him of who he was, he slipped further away. He became a man I could no longer recognize, painted in wealth but hollow in spirit. I would sometimes see his face on magazine covers, in business articles, on television interviews. He wore expensive suits, his hair slicked back, his smile polished but empty. They called him a genius, a self-made millionaire, a rising star. I wanted to scream at the screen, he is not self-made. He was made from my sacrifices, from my sleepless nights, from my blood and bones. But of course, no one would hear. No one wanted the story of a tired old woman behind the empire. While he soared in the sky, I lived quietly on the ground. My body grew weaker with age, arthritis set into my hands, making even sewing painful. I picked up part-time work at a grocery store, stocking shelves at dawn. My neighbors sometimes asked, "Doesn't your son take care of you? Isn't he rich now?" I would force a smile and lie, saying, "He insists I keep busy. He doesn't want me to grow lazy." But at night, when the loneliness pressed against my chest like a stone, I wept into my pillow, asking God why my only child had abandoned me. Then, as if the heavens had finally grown tired of his arrogance, the fall began. It started with whispers in the news, an investigation into his company, rumors of fraud, lawsuits piling up. At first, Daniel brushed them off. "It's nothing, Mama," he told me on one of his rare calls, his voice still dripping with confidence. "These things happen in business. Don't worry," but worry I did. Soon, the headlines turned darker. Investors pulled out, accusing him of lies. His so-called friends, the men who drank his wine and laughed at his jokes, suddenly vanished. The glamorous fiancée, who once clung to him like a shadow, broke off the engagement and left with another wealthy man. I watched it unfold like a storm ripping through everything he had built. The mansion was sold to cover debts. His cars, his watches, his tailored suits, all gone. Piece by piece, the empire he had chosen over me collapsed into rubble. One rainy evening, as I was returning from the grocery store with aching legs and a bag of discounted bread, I saw a figure sitting on the steps of my apartment building. At first, I thought it was a beggar. His clothes were dirty, his hair unkempt, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. But as I drew closer, my heart froze. It was Daniel. He lifted his head slowly, and in his eyes I saw not the arrogant millionaire, not the polished man from the magazines, but the little boy who used to cry in the night, calling for his mama. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Mama, I have nowhere else to go." I stood still, the rain soaking through my coat, my bag slipping from my fingers. 1,000 emotions clashed inside me: rage, grief, pity, love. This was the son who had once turned me away from his mansion, ashamed of my patched clothes. And now, he sat on my steps, with nothing left but shame. For a moment, I wanted to turn him away, to let him taste the bitterness of abandonment the way I had for years. But when I looked at his face, pale and hollow, I saw the boy I once held in my arms, the boy who once promised to make me proud. My voice was steady, though my heart quaked. "Get up, Daniel. Come inside before you catch your death in the rain." He broke then, his strong shoulders shaking as he wept openly like a child. I watched him crumble, the mighty man reduced to pieces, and I knew this was life's doing, this was karma's hand. Still, I opened the door, not because I had forgotten his betrayal, but because a mother's heart, no matter how scarred, never fully stops beating for her child. As he stepped into my small apartment, dripping rainwater onto the worn floor, I felt something strange stir inside me. It wasn't triumph, though part of me whispered, "Now you know what it feels like." It wasn't quite forgiveness either. It was power. For years, I had been the one at his mercy, waiting for his calls, his affection, his acknowledgement. But now, here he was, stripped of everything, with no one in the world but me. Life had punished him far more deeply than I ever could, and for the first time in decades, I felt the balance shift. Daniel slept on my old sofa that first night, curled into himself like a boy, though he was a man in years. His once expensive shoes lay by the door, caked in mud, and his shirt, wrinkled and torn, hung off his shoulders like rags. I watched him from my small chair, the memories of his betrayal gnawing at me. This was the same son who had once told me to sit at the back of his engagement party, the son who had forgotten me for mansions and money. And now, here he was, reduced to nothing, begging for shelter in the very home he had abandoned. I won't lie, a part of me felt satisfaction. Not the loud, fiery satisfaction of vengeance, but a quiet, almost bitter one. I had not needed to lift a finger. Life itself had humbled him. Where once he had shone like a star, blinding everyone with his arrogance, Now he was nothing more than a man stripped bare by the storm. The next morning, I made him breakfast, plain rice and boiled eggs. He devoured it as if it were a feast. Watching him eat, I thought of all the times I had skipped meals to feed him as a child. The irony made me smile to myself. "Thank you, Mama," he murmured, his voice cracking. But gratitude was not enough. I had carried too much pain for too long, so I set my terms. "If you want to stay here, Daniel, you will not lie around. This is not a hotel. You will work, you will clean, you will earn your place." His eyes widened, almost in disbelief. Perhaps he expected me to cradle him, to comfort him as I always had. But no, this time, I wanted him to feel the weight of humility, to rebuild himself brick by brick, not with money but with dignity. So he scrubbed my floors. He washed the dishes until his soft, once manicured hands turned red and raw. He carried groceries with me, walked beside me to the market, and sat at my old sewing machine, learning to stitch torn clothes. At first he resisted, his pride stinging. But with nowhere else to go, he bent beneath the weight of his new reality. There were nights when he broke down, tears spilling as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Mama. I was blind. I thought money made me powerful, but it only made me a fool." I would listen, silent, my heart torn. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to list every wound he had carved into me. But another part, the part that had carried him in my womb, the part that had rocked him to sleep through fevers and nightmares, act to soothe him. It was in those moments I realized something. My revenge was not in rejecting him. My revenge was in making him face the life he had once looked down upon, in showing him that the woman he had been ashamed of was stronger than all his riches. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, Daniel changed. The arrogance drained from him, replaced by humility. He began to see me not as the poor, embarrassing mother he had once hidden, but as the pillar that had kept him alive. One evening, as we sat together in the dim light of my kitchen, he reached across the table and took my hands in his. His palms were rough now, no longer the soft hands of a man who paid others to work for him. "Mama," he whispered, his voice thick with tears, "I don't deserve your kindness. I abandoned you, I hurt you, I betrayed everything you gave me. But life has shown me what I truly am without you, nothing. Forgive me, please." I looked into his eyes, and for the first time in years, I saw not the millionaire, not the failure, but simply my son. The boy I had raised with love and sacrifice. The boy who once promised to make me proud. Tears filled my eyes as I cupped his face in my hands. "Daniel, revenge was never mine to take. Life took it for me. All I ever had left to give you was forgiveness." He broke then, sobbing against my hands, and I let him. I held him the way I had when he was little, rocking him gently as though time had folded back on itself. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Forgiveness was not weakness. It was the sweetest revenge of all. Because while money had destroyed him, my love, the very love he had once rejected, was the only thing that could rebuild him. So I forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. And as the sun rose the next morning, spilling light through my small window, I knew that though life had crushed him, it had also brought him back to where he truly belonged. Back to me.